Hi there everyone, welcome back to Dandelion Delphi tutorials. Today we're going to have a look at the final of 2021 question 3, which would be your OOP question. In your exam you can expect question 3 to first start with a scenario to explain what this is about. And this whole scenario is about popular hiking trails. Then they explain to you the folder and the class unit that you would have to open once your program is open. And then they also give you an example of the GUI. Take note here that you are not allowed to add any additional attributes or fields or methods unless you are asked to do so. So don't do more than the question is asking you to do here. Now, before the question starts, they will then describe the object class to you. There's the name, and we usually expect them to give us this class, but you could be asked to create it yourself. You can view more about that in my OOP lesson. In this table here, they are going to describe the attributes. So they list them down here and then the description on the right. Read through them because they sometimes have interesting information. During the exam, they'll open the program as usual by clicking File Open and click on the .dpr. But then go to the right here. There's that class unit or object unit. Double click on that so that you can now view those fields here because these data types are very important. They would then also describe what was provided. So here the constructor was provided with parameters that are assigning values to the attributes. And then they say complete the object class following these questions. Now question 3.1 is in your class, so make sure that is where you are coding. And any method that is not done in the class but described in question 3.1 for the class is not going to score any marks even if it is correct. So let's have a look at the first question. Write an accessor method. When you see the word accessor method, you immediately know that that would be a function and give it the same name as described in the paper. Sometimes they give us call statements, so it would be important to use that same name. And these are two very easy marks, so go and try them yourself. Press pause and I'll show you the memo. A reminder that accessor methods are always public. So under public, we'll declare the accessor method, get number of days. And since it's returning the field or attribute, if number of days, that is an integer, the data type of this function should also be an integer. Once you've done that, remember that semicolon at the end, you'll push Control-Shift-C, and then you will add this code. An accessor method never has parameters, and all it does is return one of the attributes. So remember your function has a result. The result is assigned to F number of days. The marks were allocated here for this heading to have the integer return data type and for it to be a function, and then 1 mark for this line of code. In question 3.1.2, they just say write a method, so they don't tell us whether it is a function or a procedure. But if you see the word return, you know it's a function. So accessor methods and return means we have to write a function. If we have a look at this, it does not indicate that it's receiving any values. Therefore, it will have no parameters. You need to calculate the average number of kilometers that must be completed per day to complete the trail within a certain number of days. And then important is that you had to round this off to the nearest integer. So if I have to write a function, because it has the word return in there, Usually with an average it is real, but since they say rounded off to the nearest integer, my return data type of my result would be an integer. Try this question and press pause and then watch the memo. So again, by default, we would declare these functions or procedures as public unless the question states otherwise. And then we'll press Control-Shift-C. Remember, no receive appeared in the question, so we would not have parameters here. Control-Shift-C will then create the skeleton code. There was one mark allocated for it being a function and returning an integer data type. Then remember, every function has a result, and we had to round this value off. So making use of the round function, we had to take the distance field and divide it by the number of days. The marks here were allocated for one for round and then one for your calculation. Remember, the distance and the number of days would get a value in our constructor here where they provided for us. So the number of days that we want to complete it in and the distance is set in the constructor, and this will always run first. So you can now assume that these fields or attributes have values, and then calculate the average the average distance that we have to complete per day, making use of this calculation. Question 3.1.3 says write a method called determine level to determine and return the difficulty level of the trail as a string. So return is in there again, definitely a function, and the return data type, they gave it there for us as a string. They also explain here that it will return advanced, moderate, or easy, and then they say write code to do the following. Call the calc distance per day, that's the function we wrote there at the top, to return the distance that must be completed per day. We have to then use that value to determine the difficulty level. Advanced would be if the distance per day is more than 15 kilometers and the terrain is either rocky or sandy. Moderate if the distance is between 10 and 15 kilometers. So here you can see it's more than 15, but here it includes 15. Make sure of that. And here they say easy if the difficulty level is neither advanced or moderate. So that's your last option. As you can see, these three bullets clearly indicate to me that I should be making use of a nested if in here to return the result of advanced, moderate, or easy. Press pause and try it yourself. Here is my function determine level, returning a string. Remember your semicolon, Control-Shift-C, and then we'll create determine level. Just remember here at the top, we have this attribute F terrain type that would contain the word sandy or rocky as indicated in the question. In this function, remember you are allowed to create your own local variables. So I could have used a local variable iDistance and then assigned calculate distance per day to iDistance and then used iDistance here. I didn't use this method. I just used calculate distance everywhere. However, there was a mark allocated for calling the calc distance per day function. That was the first mark. Then you had to determine if the distance was more than 15 and that it was either a rocky or sandy terrain. So it was very important here to have the extra set of brackets there because it had to read the distance is greater than 15 and the terrain is either rocky or sandy. Without these brackets, so if we take those brackets away, how this is reading is it's saying the distance is greater than 15 and rocky, then it would be advanced. or any sandy terrain regardless of the distance. So those brackets that we have there to group this together with the or is extremely important. On this line here, you got marks for indicating that this was greater than 15. That was the second mark. The third mark here was for that it was rocky. And then to add the or sandy, so this bit here, that was another mark. If this if statement was true, the result was advanced. If this was not true, then we had to do the next bullet in the paper that indicated to us here that it would be moderate if the distance was kilometers from 10 to 15, which was interesting because let's say it was more than 15, but not rocky or sandy, it would actually fall under easy. But anyway, don't overthink it. You just follow the instructions of the paper. That's very important. So this is a nested if, and we would get a mark there for the else. It's really like giving a mark for the nested if. Then our next condition here says, is this distance that we calculated a value from 10 to 15? I prefer to use the in operator. It's a bit quicker to type. And there was a mark here to include 10 and 15. But you can also write this if statement like this, where you say the distance is greater or equal to 10 and the distance was less than or equal to 15. Just make sure to include those and that it's an and here. But I do prefer to use the in operator when this variable here is an integer, maybe a char. So here we got marks for that range, and then also got a mark for allocating moderate to our result. Our result, remember, is a string. There we go. And it has to return either advanced, moderate, or easy. This last else here does not need an if statement, because if it wasn't advanced and it wasn't moderate, it would be easy. And here was your last mark for that. Okay, so here's our next method. Again, not telling us exactly what we need to do, but if I glance at it, immediately this word return jumps at me. So take to your exam maybe a highlighter, even a pen. It doesn't matter. You have to have a pen anyway to sign the register. So just to underline for yourself return, so then you know, okay, it's a function. It says what it must be called, so function calc total cost. And here's that new word, then the next word that we need to look out for is the word receive. Receive the number of hikers in a group. And then they also help us by telling us as a parameter. But the word receive immediately indicates to me that it has a parameter. It returns the total cost for the group. Cost immediately sounds like a real return data type for me, and it's based on the cost per person attribute. Press pause, try it yourself, and then only watch the memo. As I said, it would be a function because the word return was in there, and receive indicated the parameter. It was a number of people, so that would be an integer. A cost is usually real, so the return data type there would be real. And also remember they said that we were going to use this cost per person. After declaring your signature here at the top, you'll press Ctrl-Shift-C. It was a very simple calculation. We just had to use our parameter and multiply that with the cost per person attribute and return that as our result. The marks were allocated that you had to have a function with the real data type here. For those guys who know procedures with reference parameters, please don't use them. You're not allowed to use them anymore in final exams, so forget about them. If you haven't heard about them, great. Just use your function. And my result then getting the value of this calculation was then worth 2 marks. one for the calculation, and one for allocating that answer to a result. The last question here in our class is asking us to write a toString. Sometimes the toString is provided, and sometimes it's partially given and we have to complete it. But here we have to write it to return the attributes of the object as follows. Just remember, you don't have to create those little brackets there. Those just indicate that it is either an attribute from your class or a function from your class. Things like the colon needs to be there, done by you, hard-coded, kilometers in, days. And here they also describe the format here as a currency, but cost per day would be one of our labels. Don't be lazy with your labels because there are marks allocated for them. And then they also give you an example here. Press pause and try it yourself. We're going to write the function toString. ToStrings don't have parameters. They are always public, and they always return a string data type, as they are really used to return the attributes of our class as a string. Then you're going to press Ctrl-Shift-C. So our first mark was allocated here for our signature function toString and string data type. One mark there. We had to now return the result. So our first line in our result will just initialize that first bit. From here on, so after the first line, you'll always have result is assigned to result plus something. If you run your program later on and you just get the last line, just come back to your toString. You probably forgot to build your result as a string here. So we have to return these fields: the F trail name, terrain type, distance, number of days, and cost per person. That was all worth 1 mark. Also remember to add your colon and your #10s or 13s to create your enters, named line breaks. And then, of course, if distance and number of days were integers, so we had to interstring that. And don't forget to add your label cost per person and kilometers in. And then our floater string F to display as a currency formatted to 2 decimal places. If we have a look at the mark allocation, the typecasting, in other words, interstring and floater string F, with your currency and your comma 2, that was all worth 1 mark. And then to have your text, so your kilometers, days, cost per person, and your #10s or #13s, that was worth another 1 mark. So all in all, 1, 2, 3, 4 marks for a toString. I always recommend that you now save and run your program. If you haven't, I mean, you should save a little bit more often, but maybe the end of your class, end of question 3.1, must be a reminder to you to save and run. Yes, you won't get any output yet, but it would pick up on some syntax errors for you. This is where question 3.2 starts. So you now need to move over to your main program. And in question 3.2.1, we are going to code in the combo box. In a question, the top bit here indicates where you are going to code. So this should be done in the onClick event of the combo box. Information on the hiking trails are provided in different text files. Take note of that. The name of the hiking trail is provided and is the same as the name of the text file. So let's quickly have a look at that text files. At the bottom of the screen here, you can see the text files and they have the names of the hiking trails. When you run the program, you will see that these are the names and then obviously with a .txt at the back. So we are going to code on the inside here of the combo box. You can double click on it, but the papers usually have comments. So you can also press F12 and just go to the comment for question 3.2.1. They then describe the text file as usual, but this text file looks a little different from what we are used to. It contains in one text file just these 4 lines: terrain type, distance, number of days, and cost of the bookings. And then they gave us an example of one of them: Rocky 106 and 1500. Then they say code has been provided to extract the selected hiking trail as the person selected from there. So really just storing input from the user, and also to display an image of the trail. Each time the name of the trail is selected in a combo box, you must do the following. A new object must be instantiated. So instantiation just means that you have to call your constructor create. You have to open the correct text file, read the information for the name of the trail to be able to open the correct text file, read the terrain, distance, number of days, and cost per person from your text file, and then use all of this information that you read there to instantiate your object. In other words, call your constructor create. Always remember that your constructor create will be called after reading all this data or having data stored in variables, local variables in that button. It could be from objects, but in this case, it is from a text file. And then you have to display a message in a dialog box to indicate you've been successful. Now, many times when we find that learners get 149 out of 150 in a practical paper, we would often, this would be the mark that they lose, because they know so well how to do this that they forget to read this message or read this part of the paper and do the dialog box, just meaning a show message to say object has been instantiated. That's it. Also remember, if you are struggling with this question, there is a mark for this, even if you didn't accomplish whatever was asked above. So make sure you do as much input and output as you can. Press pause and try this yourself. Oh, my program is still running, so we can just break it there. And this is now the time for you to move over to the main form. And we're going to code inside here. So either you double click on here and you code in there, or you just press F12, and let's say it opens there. You just scroll to where it says question 3.2.1. This code here was provided, but also important to know how to do it yourself. Obviously, getting input from the combo box, you can use the .text property, or you can use item square brackets and the item index method, and then being able to load a picture from a text file or from a file. The name of the file, always important to include the file extension, which in this case was the .jpg. Now, they did not ask us here to test if the file exists, but it is important that you always test if the file exists. The name of the text file is stored in strail, but remember to add your .txt wherever you need to use it, which we need to use in file exist as well as in assign file. Now, in this year, there were no marks allocated here for the file exist, but in previous years there were. So to be safe, just add that code. We had to now assign file, T file, make sure that it is declared as a text file and not just as text. That won't work. And assign file of the name that we stored above, plus the .txt, the file extension, and then reset. So these two easy marks, both worth 1 mark each. Usually we would make use of a while loop to read through the text file, but these text files each only contain 4 lines each, and each one represented a different value. So there wasn't need for pause, copy, and delete that we often use. The first line was the terrain type, and that was stored then. Remember the rocky and sandy that we did earlier on? That was stored then in S type. The next line there was the distance. What is interesting about a read line is this data type here does not have to be a string. It can be any data type as long as it's compatible with the data it's storing from the text file. So if there was a word in the second line, this won't work. It is important, and I made a mistake here, it is important to have a look at your class and see what was the distance that they provided for us. It was actually an integer. Don't know why on earth I made it real, but this here should be, ooh, it's an integer. I changed it to an integer, but I didn't change the prefix there. So let's just change it there to an I, and then I'll change it there to an I as well. So the second line there was the distance, and I read that directly into the variable I distance. The third line then was the number of days, also an integer, and then the cost, which was real. If you have a look here at cost, this was real, so I'll definitely declare that as real. And don't forget your close file. There wasn't a mark here this year for the close file, but there could be. So always remember your close file. Then we had to instantiate our object. Now, just a quick reminder, the way I do it is copy the declaration that they give you. So they usually give it here at the top. Copy your declaration where you want to instantiate, change it to an assignment statement, add dot create, and if all above is fine, you'll actually get some hints as to which values and order it needs to be sent in, your arguments. So there I have the code I showed you guys just now. This was worth 2 marks, 1 mark for that part, 1 mark for that part. Then in your brackets, you have to send it arguments. And these arguments must match the parameters of my constructor. So let's copy this constructor out. You can do this in an exam as well to help you. We can copy out the constructor. It had an enter there, so let's just comment all of that out. And we need to keep in mind, if you've watched my previous videos, not number, how many parameters were there. The parameters and the arguments need to match in NOD. First one is number. So there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parameters. For that reason, I need to have, let's just move over, I need to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 arguments. That is the N of NOD. That was with 1 mark. Then the O stands for order and the D for data type, and the 2 together both count 1 mark. So the first 2, order. Trail goes first, terrain type goes second, number of days third, distance fourth, cost fifth. That's the order. Then data type. 2 strings, 1 integer, 2 integers actually, that was an integer as well, and then the cost, which was real. So number, order, and data type, very important. And then finally that 1 mark for instantiating the object. So let's say you couldn't do any of this, hopefully you tried it. You can still get your 1 mark for the show message. We are at last at a point where we can test our program. Always important to save it before you test it. But when you click on any of these, you should see your message and a little picture being displayed. Lovely pictures. In the next question, they are asking us to use the Tostring to display the object information in the rich edit. They gave us an example here of the Amatola hiking trail, and this is the information you should see. Also take note though of what I call hidden questions. Sometimes they have marks, sometimes they don't. But you can see that the information is displayed at the top of a rich edit. That means you should use a .clear before displaying your Tostring. Press pause, try to solve, and this was worth 2 marks, 2 easy marks. In this year, we did not give a mark for the dot clear, but added. It doesn't take long to add the dot clear before you call your object, your toString object. Remember now, once we've instantiated the object, we're done with the T hiking trail. We're now just going to use the object obj hiking trail and then a dot and the method. So if I look at this here, I have the rich edit.lines.add. Your toString would be called in an output object like a rich edit, a label, a show message, or maybe even written to a text file. And then the object, and then a dot toString. Remember, a toString is a function, so it has to be called as part of another statement. Like, for example, output in a rich edit. Can't stand on its own like a procedure. Again, if you were struggling, you can just display anything in the rich edit. This part of the code here was worth 1 mark, and then calling your toString was worth the second. So you could get one of the marks by just adding your rich edit.lines.add. Let's run the program, and we select the one they gave us. Object has been instantiated, and then we can display it and see that we can see the information in this rich edit. In the third button of the form, they ask you to make use of an input box to enter the number of hikers in the group. Remember, number of hikers would be an integer, and then to use the calculate cost method to assign the cost of the group to the provided cost variable. They provided you with a variable there. And then test your program with Amatola hiking trail and a group of 7. Pause this video, code it yourself, test it, and then only watch the memo. They provided not only the variable, but also the output here in the panel for our cost. So make sure you use that. We had to get input from the user from an input box and store it as an integer. And that was worth a mark. And then we had to store in our cost. We had to call the function calculate cost. But remember, if you go back to calculate cost here at the top, you can see that calculate cost had one parameter of integer data type. So if we go here, we would need to send it one argument of integer, and that was the number of hikers. So that input variable there that we stored in inum, we would have to use to call our function calc total cost. This was worth 3 marks. One actually for this part here, just to store a value in our cost, then to call your calc cost function correctly. You couldn't call it as a procedure to score the mark. You had to call it as part of the statement. And then 1 mark for sending it that variable there as an argument. Now we can test it again. Always use that, I call it the buggy button. The button with the ladybug on it. If you have loops, that button there allows you to have the stop or break button available to you, whereas the other one doesn't, and you can't get out of your loop. So make sure you use the buggy button. Okay, we actually don't need to click on this toString button again to test this, because this was not processing anything. You can just click here and say 7 hikers, and then my output should look the same as the one on the screen. Don't worry about the 1000 separator. This one is showing a comma. Mine is showing a space. That's okay, but always make sure that you have the correct number of decimal places shown. Now, if I just click on this button again, you'll see the 7 is there already. They didn't tell us to set a default value here for input, but I always just add an input value there anyway. The value that I add as the last argument of my input box, that's going to appear in my input box, and it speeds up the testing of my program. So I don't have to type something every single time. Let's say I had to test this 7 times, then I would have to type 7 times. So what I do is I have a look at the example of output. If there's more than one, I just look at the first one. And if they say here, use 7 as the example of input and output, in my input box, then I would add the 7 there. So it's already there. You're going to type it once anyway, so you might as well type it while you're coding instead of having to type it several times while you're testing your program. In this last question, they are asking us to write code to use the object's methods. You wrote them all, and now you need to make use of them as much as you can. To display the difficulty level and recommended distance per day in this following format in the rich edit. So again, we have these little brackets. They indicate there that this is either a variable, which in this case it's not, or a function or method, well, a function, because procedures can't be displayed in a rich edit. They would stand on their own. So these would all be functions. Distance per day and the difficulty level, as well as the number of days. So all three of these are methods that you have to use to display this output in your rich edit. Press pause and I'll show you some output just now. So try this and then I'll show you the output. Here is the output for Amatola hiking trails. So press pause and try and test yours quickly. And then here is also Rim of Africa that you can test, which should indicate moderate. Again, when I look at this output, it's at the top of the rich edit for the 2 clicks. So add your .clear. There wasn't a mark allocated for this again, but do it because there could be. I have placed this over several lines, but you could have just one long line of code here. I was just trying to place as much as I can on the screen so it's easier to see and I don't have to scroll left and right. There you have your labels, and then we have to call the calc distance per day. Remember, it returns an integer data type, so therefore we have to use into string around object hiking trail dot calculate distance. Then we add to that the next part of the label. Then we add to that determine level. Now remember, determine level, if you go back here, was a string. That was advanced, medium, or moderate, or easy. So that does not need any typecasting like into string because it's already a string. And then the next label, and then the number of days. The accessor method that we wrote right at the beginning, that was our first method that we wrote, and that was into string. And then at the end, after this, I have the days label there added. And the marks here were allocated for calling these 3 functions correctly. So your calculate distance with your into string, your determine level, no typecasting, and then your get number of days where you had to into string that as well. Now it is time to click on our buggy and we can test it. So we need to test always by making use of what they're asking us. Amatola hiking trails, so let's pick that one. And again, we don't need this. That doesn't calculate anything for us. We can just click on that button and double check. Is it the same? 17 kilometers advanced. Ooh, there's an error. This should be in capital letters. And I have mine in lowercase. Now, there wasn't a mark allocated for it, but you never know. So I would go back and change that and make sure that mine also returns in capital letters, just in case. And then it was 6 days long. If we have a look, remember that some of that information came from your text file. This next one here, which one did they pick? The Rim of Africa. So if we pick the Rim of Africa and we click on this, then it should say moderate, 11 and 56. But I think it's a good idea to ensure that we score full marks, that we go back to determine level and change this to advanced, capital letters, moderate, capital letters, and easy in capital letters. As you can see, Sometimes it is not clear in the paper in question 3.1 as to what the output should look like for a toString, or in this case, a function that returns a string. So sometimes it is a good idea to just quickly have a look at what is the output showing us here. When we are coding 3.1, we quickly have a glance at 3.2 to have a look at how things are displayed. Thank you everyone for watching Dandelion Delphi tutorials. In my Dandelion Delphi Book 3, I explain more about object-oriented programming, where there's lots of rules that you can study and little hints on how to read your question paper and know how to answer and write a method. Should it be a function? Should it be a procedure? Should it have parameters? And more. Please feel free to ask some questions in the chat and I will answer as soon as I can. Hope to see you soon.